By the end of April 1945, Allied forces have liberated almost all of Italy from Nazi occupation. An occupation no Italian ever wanted. By Lake Como, close to the Swiss border, a large German SS convoy is heading north. When a small patrol of Italian partisans stop them at a makeshift roadblock. The Nazis in the lead jeep demand to be let through.
Orders from Hitler!
But just as they're about to let the Germans pass, one of the men notices something strange. At the back of the vehicle, a man in Nazi uniform is trying not to be noticed. On closer inspection, they realize who it is.
Il Duce, Vieni fuori.
He stopped at the roadblock, and although he's doing his best wearing a uniform to actually disguise himself, he's of course instantly recognized. And so is his lover at the time, Clara Petacci.
Il Duce, Benito Mussolini, Italy's fascist dictator, is arrested immediately. It's the final fall from grace for a man who held his country under an evil spell for over 2 decades. Mussolini's evolution begins in 1883 in the village of Pradapio in the Romagna region of northeastern Italy, where he is born into a family fallen on hard times.
The grandfather had to sell the family land, and I think somewhere in Mussolini's soul was the desire to reclaim family success.
Like so many in Romagna, he is raised in a family of radical socialists who are often jailed for their political beliefs. Mussolini's father is a blacksmith who spends more time womanizing and drinking than working at the anvil, leaving the family little money to survive.
Mussolini grew up with a really strong resentment of people who had more than he had. He knew he was much smarter than anyone else that he met, and yet he wasn't the beneficiary of privileges.
Fueled by his family's sense of injustice, young Benito is arrogant, volatile, and a bully.
Mussolini as a child was fairly wild, I think, unruly and anarchic.
Da ragazzo Mussolini era...
As a boy, Mussolini was a rebel. He was intolerant and very quarrelsome. Relationships with his peers were often violent.
Violenti.
In games with friends, he hates to lose and often fights dirty to resolve disputes.
Durante una lotta con un rivale.
In a fight with a rival, he used a knife and injured the other boy very seriously.
Lo ferì molto seriamente.
Non sono ammessi atti di violenza in questa scuola.
Aveva adorato.
Mussolini is hauled before the fathers of his Catholic school, who he hates. They expel him, telling his parents he is beyond their control. But there is also a warm, loyal side to young Benito. These will be key to his rise to power. His brother and sister adore him. He is a dreamer who recites poetry and literature.
Mussolini was a great stage director of his own life. He had a lot of charisma and charm.
Popolo d'Italia,
From a young age, he rehearses making speeches.
Sono Benito Mussolini, seguitemi.
He practiced early on, sort of posing, and came to believe, I think, in his own theatrical image.
by the age of 18, the future dictator of Italy is a flamboyant, attractive young man, and like his father, a passionate socialist. Women are drawn to him like a magnet. But his volatile side keeps erupting.
E quindi impazziva per
He
le
was
donne.
crazy for women. He had a highly sexual personality, so any woman, young or old, to him was just an object to be preyed upon.
Diventasse per lui un oggetto di preda.
Throughout his life, Mussolini beds hundreds of women, often violently.
Mussolini, I think, tended to engage in the sort of sex that is best described as nasty, brutish and short.
Rather than be ashamed of beating and raping women, in later writings, he boasts about it.
Mussolini era...
He was an egotist. As a result, some of his behavior was strange. This strangeness got him known as the madman of Predapio and the madman of Romagna.
Il matto della Romagna.
In 1903, he avoids national service by escaping to Switzerland, where he's arrested for advocating a violent revolution. His mother dies shortly afterwards, and he goes completely off the rails.
E poi il più grande amore della sua
The
vita.
greatest love of his life was his mother, in true Italian style. She died when he was only 22, and for him, this was an extremely dark day, which he would remember for the rest of his life.
Tutta la vita.
When his father remarries, Mussolini takes an unhealthy interest in his new stepsister, 16-year-old Rachele. His father fears Benito will bring shame to the family by starting a relationship, some might think incestuous. However, he will have her, no matter what.
Mussolini said that if this girl cannot be mine, I will shoot myself. And he made the gesture to do just that. The whole thing, though, was just an act. And at that time, he had no intention of killing himself.
In 1910, Benito and Rachele start to live together. But Mussolini is sex mad and soon abandons his stepsister and marries another woman, Ida Dalsa. They have a son together, Benitino, little Benito. It's not long before he grows tired of his new family and leaves them too. At this stage, there is no sign that Mussolini, the violent, womanizing socialist, can turn into one of history's most evil dictators. But cataclysmic world events are about to change everything. 1914, World War I erupts across Europe. At first, Italy stays neutral, but many argue they should fight for a share of the spoils. As an active socialist, Benito Mussolini initially supports his nation's neutrality. By now, he has moved to Milan and found a flair for journalism, stoked by his childhood love of literature. Still in his 20s, he is made editor of Italy's biggest-selling socialist newspaper, Avanti.
Avanti gave him that platform from which he could influence the political direction of the party itself. He was a fierce supporter of revolution in Italy.
But then he starts to think that the war could be the spark to transform the country, even start a revolution. If so, Italy must be part of it. In April 1915, he's arrested for organizing pro-war demonstrations. But the socialists and Avanti don't share his views. he is expelled from the party and resigns from the newspaper. To get back at them, he starts a publication of his own.
He wants a platform for his ideas, and so he gets together money from various sources, and he sets up a newspaper called Il Popolo d'Italia, the People of Italy.
On the 24th of May 1915, Mussolini gets his wish as Italy finally joins the conflict. Having argued so passionately for war, now he can fight in it.
When Italy declares war in the spring of 1915, he volunteers. He gets wounded in an accident with a mortar, and there are photographs of him on crutches. After that, he goes back to his job as a newspaper editor.
While recovering, he writes editorials on his sickbed, and an idea starts to take form.
He began thinking that perhaps the route to a revolution in Italy might be to organize the veterans of the war after they came home. Mussolini referred to them as the aristocracy of the trenches.
Sure enough, when the war ends in 1918, Italy is in a miserable state and ripe for change. Despite being on the winning side, the country has gained almost nothing in the peace settlement. Communists and socialists are causing trouble on Italian streets, calling for a revolution like Russia's. By now, Mussolini has completely turned his back on the left. He wants to forge his own path, one based on the glory of Italy and its Roman past.
Mussolini had become more and more in love with his own country and dreaming about running it and thinking about how he could make it a great power.
He decides to put his ideas into action. He calls for a radical new movement to be formed, one which he will lead by the force of his personality.
Even though he seems to be kind of this warm guy, and people saw him sometimes as almost empathic, it's a veneer, it's a facade. And he knew that that warmth, that he seemed to give off was manipulating in itself.
Mussolini appeals to disillusioned war veterans who share both his anger with the old liberal parliamentary system and his fear of a communist takeover. They believe that extreme nationalism and a one-party state are what will make Italy great again. And they adopt the Roman axe, the fascio, as their symbol. They call themselves fascists. Many of them wear the black shirt of the deity, Italy's fearsome commando unit in the war.
The fascist black shirts, the street fighters, believed that political debates, voting, all of the trappings of democracy were either foolish or weak or a fraud. If you wanted something, you took it.
And Mussolini's thugs are armed to the teeth.
Fascists were very often led by demobilized junior officers, and they had access to weapons. Often they kept weapons themselves from the war. They had revolvers, but they also had more exotic weapons. The manganello, the heavy club, was one of their characteristic weapons, but knuckle dusters, sometimes even weird instruments. I mean, there's one fascist group, for example, that beat up its enemies using sticks of dried cod.
Mussolini becomes their leader, and they call him Il Duce, the boss. He organizes his fascists into fighting units, instructing them to beat and humiliate his opponents.
gli squadristi prendevano I capi socialisti.
The units would attack the socialist leaders, capture them, tie fascist slogans around them, make them look ridiculous, force them to drink powerful laxatives, making them soil themselves to destroy their public image.
La loro immagine. E I fascisti lo...
And the fascists mocked them and took pictures, which then appeared in the newspapers.
Mussolini's fascist movement takes off, going from 20,000 to almost 200,000 members in just a few months. While his thugs battle communists in the streets, Mussolini tries to broaden his power base. The fascist movement becomes the Fascist Party, and in 1921, he is elected to parliament. Campaigning reveals his supreme skill. Throughout his career, with one masterful speech, the Duce can turn crowds into screaming, adoring hordes.
In cui Roma aveva Cesare, Virgilio ed Augusto.
He had the ability to move people, to control their emotions, to get them to listen to him, that he was eloquent and he was persuasive. There was something almost magical that would suck people into his thinking. You had these gigantic crowds shouting, Duce, 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 because he in effect kind of hypnotized them.
In 1922, as Italy descends further into chaos, Mussolini seizes the moment. Through the power of his oratory, he's going to mobilize enough fascists onto the streets to try to force the state to hand him power. He urges his supporters to march on Rome. But their leader isn't amongst them. Behind the scenes, the master of propaganda is working away.
He saw it as a kind of an act. He was staging what looked like a revolution, but at the same time secretly assuring the army leadership and the monarchy that this was only play acting.
Mussolini later claims hundreds of thousands join the march. In reality, only 16,000 bedraggled, mainly unarmed marchers show up. The police and army turn a blind eye.
It was an untypically wet October. They drowned whilst waiting. They didn't know what to do. No orders were coming. Mussolini was nowhere to be seen.
He's actually in Milan. He's really sitting beside the telephone, waiting for other politicians to ring him up and say, "Psst, you want to be minister of this, or would you like to be perhaps prime minister?"
Terrified of a revolution, Italy's head of state, King Victor Emmanuel III, calls on Mussolini to lead a new coalition government. Through his ability to stir up the mob, the boss has bluffed and bullied his way to power. It's the beginning of Italy's descent into hell. While Mussolini attempts to be statesmanlike, his black shirts are still on the streets, causing mayhem. Violence has been his way of life, and now with power in his grasp, he has the means to inflict it on anyone who stands in his way. Socialist politician Giacomo Matteotti is making threats to expose the fascists' violent tactics. So he needs to be silenced. A unit of black shirts assaults Matteotti, who suffers a heart attack and is buried in a shallow grave just outside Rome.
when he realized that his own personal bodyguards had murdered this socialist member of parliament, he tried to cover it up.
When Matteotti's body is recovered, Mussolini denies any involvement, and the murder does its job. Political opponents are terrorized into silence. With Italy cowed into submission, he can fulfill his dream of a second Roman Empire spanning the globe, with himself as the new emperor. Just like somebody else, a few hundred miles away. He receives a request asking for a signed photograph from an admirer in Germany. Mussolini refuses. He doesn't consider the letter writer important. That will soon change, because the letter is from the man who will devastate both his life and that of his country. Adolf Hitler. In 1925, the Duce declares Italy a dictatorship. All political parties are closed down, except the fascists.
Mussolini was completely anti-democratic. In his political model, there was no role for any kind of opposition.
With Italy under his complete command, Mussolini can indulge his greatest passion: showmanship.
Fascism was characterized by the cult of the leader, and Mussolini played up to this in a very big way, and was always posing for the cameras. He had remarkable staring eyes. Everything was done to present him as a kind of Nietzsche-type Superman, a man who was virile, who was athletic, who was a great sportsman, who had a great torso, and he had no qualms about stripping to the waist and showing off his, as he would see it, his manly torso.
It really is impossible to imagine Adolf Hitler taking off his shirt and exhibiting himself, whereas Mussolini does get photographed bringing in the harvest. He's a mass-age politician.
Mussolini becomes a role model for every would-be dictator of the 20th century and beyond. At first, Italy prospers under fascism. A massive scheme of public works dramatically reduces unemployment. Mussolini reaches an almost divine status at home and abroad. Churchill hails him as a genius. FDR says he is deeply impressed by him.
Qual era l'immagine pubblica di Mussolini fuori dall'Italia?
The public image of him outside of Italy was completely positive, because from the outside it was a country of rebels and Mussolini had made it whole.
E Mussolini l'aveva messo a posto.
He had defeated the Bolshevik threat. He had made the trains run on time and had united a divided Italy.
Aveva messo l'Italia in divisa.
But controlling his own country isn't enough for the Duce.
One of the terms that sums Italy up very well, I think, is the idea that it was the least of the great powers, that it was bottom of the first division. And you can find Mussolini himself using that football metaphor.
He is particularly jealous of the great colonial empires of Britain and France.
Mussolini aveva l'ambizione di
Mussolini had the ambition to restore the Roman Empire. He wanted to send his fascist legions to where the Roman legions had gone before, including into Libya and North Africa.
del Nord.
Italy had controlled Libya since 1911. But after the First World War, Libyan tribesmen rise up against their imperial masters. Mussolini orders a brutal policy of pacification.
He
orders his generals to exterminate any opposition, to lock them in concentration camps.
Campo di concentramento.
The Italian policy in Libya was a story of utter brutality, up there with the worst moments of European colonialism.
100,000 Libyan tribesmen are rounded up and forced to march across the desert. Most die on the journey. The majority are women, children, and the elderly. And for political leaders, there's an even worse punishment.
There was a saying among the Libyan Arabs, he went to Rome, but he never got to Rome. He was thrown out of the plane a couple of miles outside of the village. They eradicated these people and took the leader, Omar el-Mukhtar, and hanged him in front of 20,000 Libyans.
In total, around half of Libya's population are wiped out by Mussolini's crazed delusions of a new Roman Empire. But the rest of the world pays little attention to what's happening in North Africa. Apart from the newly elected Chancellor of Germany. In 1934, Adolf Hitler finally gets to meet the man he wrote to 8 years earlier. Mussolini remains unimpressed and describes him as a silly little clown.
Adolf Hitler looks at Mussolini as someone who is providing a blueprint as to how to destroy the old order. Hitler learns from Mussolini, and he has a deep affection for him that goes beyond just admiration. It's idolization of Mussolini.
At first, it's Hitler who apes his great hero, copying the fascist salute and many of the Duce's ideas. Mussolini relishes his superiority at the beginning of their relationship. He thinks he can bully Hitler, too. In a move that will inspire the Nazis, he spends billions expanding the military. His plan is to widen his empire. So he sends his forces to a country that had embarrassed Italy in a colonial defeat 40 years earlier. In the autumn of 1935, over 500,000 Italian troops invade Ethiopia in a savage act of revenge.
Mussolini turns to Ethiopia in part because that has long been an object of Italian imperial ambitions.
It is the largest colonial army ever put into the field, and the war becomes one of the 20th century's most one-sided conflicts.
Mussolini wanted to create a kind of copy of South Africa in Ethiopia. In other words, to turn the Ethiopian population into what amounted to slaves or serfs and create a massive immigrant population of Italians who would practice a kind of apartheid. But they did so with such violence, such cruelty, such ruthlessness. There was a massive revolt in the center of the country.
This was one of the most brutal campaigns ever waged by colonial power.
Ethiopia had virtually no air force, and Italian planes could simply fly over Ethiopian villages or Ethiopian armed forces and do whatever they liked to them.
And the Duce instructs his bombers to fight dirty.
He wanted this campaign to be over quickly, and by the end of the year he said we just simply got to use poison gas on a large scale. We just got to get this war finished swiftly.
In defiance of the League of Nations, Mussolini drops mustard gas on Ethiopia, something even Hitler refuses to deploy. Emperor Haile Selassie desperately appeals to the League of Nations to intervene. But they just look the other way. Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia leaves the Lion of Judah's impoverished nation devastated.
The Ethiopian historians think that the death toll during the war is somewhere above 350,000 people, so it's a massive death toll.
The Ethiopian War was really the beginning of the Second World War. Mussolini knew full well that invading Ethiopia, he was breaking the League of Nations. It was going to give a green light to Hitler. Hitler could now see that you could act in defiance of the League of Nations and get away with it.
The bond between Mussolini and Hitler grows tighter than ever. In league with the Nazis, the Duce sends troops to aid Franco's fascists, fighting the Spanish Civil War.
Both countries got involved in the Spanish Civil War from 36-39, and the verdict was completely different. Germany fought a very, very successful campaign. Italy, the Italians were defeated in Guadalajara in a very traumatic event again, and the comparison between the two was traumatic for Mussolini.
The Spanish campaign is the first sign the Nazi war machine is better equipped for conflict than his military. But the Duce ignores all advice. However, Mussolini's philandering has come back to haunt him. The first wife he abandoned, Ida Dalsa, and their son, little Benito, have been causing him problems. Mussolini subsequently married Rachele, his stepsister, but Ida keeps surfacing, tarnishing his image.
She wanted him all for herself and so caused several scenes with Rachele Mussolini. The Duce found the situation intolerable as it risked putting him in a bad light.
The fascist dictator's ruthless side reveals itself again as he declares Ida to be mad and has her locked up.
He decided that this woman should be completely removed from view and had her put in a psychiatric hospital.
In 1937, Ida Dalsa is allegedly beaten and dies of a brain hemorrhage in the asylum. A few years later, he orders his own son, little Benito, to be murdered by lethal injection. He is just 26. The Duce thinks his ruthlessness makes him untouchable. September the 27th, 1937. With his personal affairs now in order, Mussolini is invited to Germany. And Hitler pulls out all the stops to impress his idol.
He is absolutely astounded by the progress that Germany has made during those few years. He is blown over by the show of military might and order. He realizes that the balance of power has tipped already decisively towards Hitler.
As a man obsessed with showmanship and military might, Hitler presses all of Mussolini's buttons. The Duce becomes enthralled. The silly little clown is now the ringmaster.
Mussolini comes back from his visit to Germany with a sense that really, the future lies with Germany. He's really impressed by the Nazis.
It's not just Hitler's armies that win Mussolini over. He is becoming captivated by his ideas, too. He sees the persecution of Jews in Germany as a model for the introduction of his own anti-Jewish laws.
One of the greatest blots on Mussolini's reputation were the anti-Semitic decrees of November 1938.
Until the 1930s, Jews and Catholics had lived relatively peaceably, side by side in Italy. But now, just like Germany, Jews are stripped of citizenship and barred from holding official jobs. Marriage between Italians and Jews is declared illegal.
Italian racism is defined from 1938 onwards as increasingly in terms of Italy being defined in spiritual terms as a racial community. At the root of Italian spiritual identity is Catholicism, and therefore the Jews cannot be part of the Italian spiritual community.
Mussolini certainly plays a major role in the introduction of the anti-Semitic legislation and then in its continued expansion. Italian anti-Semitism remains essentially discriminatory rather than genocidal. The Italians aren't then, until then, imagining that they're going to kill their Jews. They're imagining that they're going to separate them from the rest of the population.
Fascist and Nazi ideology converge. A military alliance, the Pact of Steel, is signed between Italy and Germany. With it, Mussolini's and his people's fate are sealed. September the 1st, 1939, Hitler invades Poland. 2 days later, Britain and France declare war on Germany. At first, Mussolini is unsure which way the war will go and tries to play the long game. But when Hitler conquers France, he is convinced there can be only one winner. On June the 10th, 1940, he throws in his lot with the Nazis. He's certain now Hitler is unstoppable, and by following him, he can fulfill his own imperial dreams. He couldn't be more wrong. He's been sucked into a conflict Italy cannot fight.
Italy is decidedly unprepared for a modern world war. Its economy remains the weakest of the competing great powers. All the advice that Mussolini gets in the spring anyway of 1940 is be careful, look, we really can't do this.
As Hitler's armies rampage through northern Europe, against all his generals' advice, Mussolini instructs his forces to begin their own separate invasions.
Without telling Hitler, he decides to go for the Balkans in a big way, and plans are drawn up for invasion of Greece, which it is assumed will be over fairly quickly.
For all Mussolini's success in Ethiopia, the invasion of Greece is a disaster. The Italian army is defeated and immediately retreat. The Nazis are forced to rescue their weaker ally and occupy Greece. On June the 22nd, 1941, Hitler independently attacks the Soviet Union. But Mussolini insists Italian troops have to be involved.
Mussolini guardava Hitler con ammirazione e con odio.
Mussolini looked at Hitler with admiration but also hate. Hate because Hitler had become the master and Mussolini had become simply an ally and moreover a secondary ally. In the Russian campaign, Mussolini insisted on sending Italian troops, which Hitler didn't want.
Mentre Hitler non li voleva.
Because of their leader's desperation to please his master, around 30,000 Italians are killed on the Eastern Front, and another 50,000 die in captivity. In 1942, news filters through of further defeats to the British in North Africa. The war is becoming a humiliation for Italy. Mussolini's unstable personality emerges again, with violent mood swings and erratic behavior.
When Mussolini had aligned himself with Hitler, he developed this kind of manic, depressive kind of behavior, going from one extreme to another.
He takes refuge in his arrogance and self-obsession.
He believes that he can do no wrong. He's a great believer in his own intuition. He says to his son-in-law at one stage, "I am the most intelligent animal that's ever existed."
But his bluster seems absurd, given the tragedy about to engulf his people. In 1943, Italy is losing the war, and Mussolini becomes seriously ill with an ulcer that's plagued him throughout his life. His grip on the country is loosening, and the writing is on the wall for his regime. The Allies are bombing the entire peninsula and have invaded Sicily.
Air raids on the Italian cities take a huge toll, both in terms of material damage, but also on the morale of the Italian people. There are increasing food shortages, rationing comes in a major way, and people are getting increasingly desperate.
Despite the suffering of his people, the Duce is too proud to surrender.
His character begins to change. He becomes more isolated. He won't listen to anyone's advice.
Unable to accept any blame, Mussolini casts around for scapegoats.
He began to use propaganda in an effort to blame the war on the Jews. He started to blame his generals, and when disaster really struck, he accused the Italian people of not being in control of their own dreams and objectives. It was always somebody else's fault.
Italians who had once been frightened into submission, even his own political allies, now turn on their leader. Mussolini's son-in-law, Count Giano, leads a vote on the Grand Council to remove him from office and end the war. The king places him under house arrest. He is confined under armed guard.
Mussolini thought that he was finished. He wanted to dedicate himself to his family.
But if Mussolini thinks he can spend the rest of his days in relative peace, Hitler has other plans. In one of the most daring rescues of the war, he dispatches gliders to where Mussolini is being held in the mountains. Without a shot being fired, he is rescued and installed as head of a new puppet regime in the north of Italy, the Republic of Salo, under Nazi control. The reversal of roles is now complete. Mussolini, the once powerful leader who wrote the book on leading by intimidation, is now utterly subservient to Hitler.
He now served merely as a puppet, in a way just repeating the words Hitler had already written.
And Hitler places conditions on Mussolini's return. He tells him he must send what Jews remain in Italy to Auschwitz. 6,000 are sent to the gas chambers, making his regime complicit in the worst crime in history. Next, Hitler orders Mussolini to execute the members of his government who had conspired to have him removed, including his own son-in-law, Count Giano. Isolated and hated by his people, reviled by his own family, his love of the Nazis and a new Roman Empire brings him close to the end.
Mussolini confessed to being finished, to being a walking corpse. The Italian population cursed the war and cursed Mussolini. In this period, he was a broken man, responsible for an Italian catastrophe.
Even worse, it's all been for nothing. Little by little, the Nazis are driven out of Italy. The Duce tries to escape with one of his many mistresses, Claretta Petacci, but the game is up.
Orders come through that Mussolini should be executed before the Allies get their hands on him, that it should be the Italian people who make judgment over him.
E adesso morirai per tutti I crimini che hai commesso in Italia, brutto bastardo. Muori, Mussolini.
Mussolini and Claretta Petacci's bodies are driven to the Piazzale Loreto in Milan. There, the Italian people, shattered by a war only their leader wanted, display their feelings.
Mussolini's corpse was battered, spat upon. His head was kicked in, and the bodies were tied around the ankles and then hoisted up so that the corpses hung upside down.
Today, there is a small minority in Italy who admire Mussolini and long for another fascist age when the trains run on time.
I think Italians have still not come to terms with Mussolini. He still has a certain appeal to young people. They are looking for direction and see him as a role model with clear ideas. His ideas may have been clear, but all they brought was a massacre.
Fascists choose to forget Mussolini led his country into a senseless war they were hopelessly unprepared for. They forget he had become Hitler's lapdog. They forget he was personally responsible for the deaths of around 1 million people in Italy and Africa, and participated in the Holocaust. A high price to pay for trains that run on time. April 1963. The 6th year of Haitian dictator Francois Duvalier's brutal reign is about to become the most bloody. At the presidential palace, the man they call Papa Doc gets shocking news. Someone has shot his children's bodyguard and chauffeur.
It absolutely outraged Duvalier and sent him into overdrive.
Blind with anger, Papa Doc summons the head of his palace guard, to whom his orders are clear. Find those responsible and kill them all. The hunt starts with a man Papa Doc wrongly accuses of being behind the attack. Former army officer Francois Benoit.
The event started at 8 o'clock on April 26, 1963. At that time, I had already been granted political asylum at the Dominican embassy.
Though personally safe from Duvalier's goons, Benoit's family, including his father, who is a judge, his wife, and infant son, remain in harm's way.
Judge Benoit and his wife had just come back from church. They were at the house with the baby and with the maid and with the visitors. I saw the truck full of presidential guards run by.
Everyone in the house is killed. and then set ablaze.
It was a terrible day. The ashes of the Benoits was there for years and years.
Over the next few hours, hundreds of people are murdered or disappear. But a horrific rumor starts to spread that a different fate awaits Benoit's infant son, who is reportedly taken to Duvalier.
Duvalier is said to have closeted himself with the boy. Nobody knows till this day what happened to Francois Benoit's little boy. Some people said he was sacrificed by Duvalier.
Sheltered at the Dominican embassy, the awful news is delivered to Benoit.
He sacrificed not only my family, but my wife's family. Anybody who was close to me, anybody who was associated with me was either arrested or killed. If you talk to a psychologist, they would classify him as a psychopath. Was he crazy? No, but was he evil? The answer is yes.
Papa Doc, the man responsible for this atrocity, is born in 1907 in the beautiful Caribbean state of Haiti. It's a proud nation, the first slave colony to become independent. In the 18th century, it was called Saint-Domingue and belonged to the French.
It was the most prosperous colony in the world at the time, turning out a huge number of crops, which were keeping the perfumed elite in Paris very well fed indeed.
It was estimated that 1 in 8 people in metropolitan France owed their living directly or indirectly to the produce of Haiti, of Saint-Domingue. It was called the Pearl of the Antilles.
In 1791, the slaves of Haiti rise up in revolution against the French colonial system. Under the leadership of Toussaint Louverture and Jean-Jacques Dessalines, they fight against all the odds to liberate their country.
They actually expelled the French army when it was at its height. This was an absolutely incredible situation, and yet the Haitian slaves rose up and defeated them, expelled them.
The slave armies defeated not just the French plantation owners, the French armies, but also the Spanish, British, the Americans, in fact, all of the superpowers of the era.
In 1804, the slaves of Saint-Domingue finally win their independence, and the nation of Haiti is born.
Malcolm X and Martin Luther King referred repeatedly back to the Haitian Revolution as being a kind of an ideal, and it was. It was a fantastic achievement.
But when Francois Duvalier is just 8 years old, Haiti loses her independence. In July 1915, with America's entrance into World War I on the horizon, the United States occupies the country. And for black Haitians like Duvalier, it's a catastrophe.
The occupation was surprisingly severe, harsh, profoundly racist.
For young Duvalier, the lack of respect for the Haitian people molds a hatred of the United States and all it stands for.
He grew up in a very cultured, articulate, black middle-class environment in Port-au-Prince, and this was precisely the class and the group that felt most aggrieved by the American occupation.
In 1934, the US military leaves Haiti, and the country becomes independent once again. It is also the year in which Duvalier completes his degree in medicine and begins a promising career serving the people of Port-au-Prince. But his real passion, a legacy of the US occupation, is black nationalist politics, and he throws himself into a movement called Noirism.
Essentially what Noirism was the reaffirmation with pride of the African roots.
Following his fascination with African heritage, Duvalier starts to study Haiti's Creole religion, Voodoo.
Voodoo is an essentially animistic religion that originates in West Africa.
People say that Haiti is 70% Catholic, 30% Protestant, but 100% Voodoo.
Voodoo has a single creator deity, Bon Dieu. But the supreme deity does not get involved with this world. Instead, powerful demigods and spirits called Loa interact with humanity.
Loas are the spirits or the gods that the Haitians pray to, just as a Catholic would pray to a saint.
As Duvalier studies voodoo rituals, he gains a better understanding of how the religion dominates the lives of local people. Though he is never a true believer, his fascination with the national religion will continuously grow on his rise to the pinnacle of power.
There's always been an association in Haiti between voodoo and power. Most Haitians believe to this day that to have become president in the first place, you must have made some kind of pact with the devil or with the dark side of voodoo.
Duvalier is a man full of contradictions. He is fascinated by Haitian mysticism, but he is also a modern medical man of science. In 1944, he gets a scholarship to study public health medicine at the University of Michigan. He will return as head of a program bringing modern medicine to the Haitian peasants, afflicted by a crippling skin disease called yours.
Papa Doc came in and says, I'm going to change that. And using penicillin, he changed it.
Duvalier becomes widely known, traveling the country, bringing his penicillin cure to remote villages across Haiti.
Duvalier actually set out walking great distances on foot. He had to subject himself to hardship to actually deliver his medical expertise to these people.
He established a reputation as a kind man, a good man, a man who could literally come into the community and make people well.
That's how he got the name Papa Doc, because throughout the country of Haiti, Papa Doc's penicillin remedies wiped out yours.
To the largely illiterate and superstitious population, Papa Doc isn't curing them with medicine alone. They think he must have mysterious voodoo abilities.
People couldn't believe it was just the medicine doing it. They believed that Papa Doc had a special power in him.
It's a turning point for Duvalier. He realizes that he can use his newly won reputation to gain total power. In 1946, Dr. Francois Duvalier, known affectionately as Papa Doc, begins to climb the Haitian political ladder. He becomes Minister for Health under a fellow Noirist, President Dumasse Estimé. But just 4 years later, the army overthrows President Estimé's regime, and Papa Doc leaves political office. Colonel Paul Magloire is installed as the new president. Duvalier goes into hiding, where he secretly begins plotting his own path to power. In a country where few are literate, he takes the opportunity to study political writings, from Marx to Machiavelli.
Machiavelli told him it's better to be feared than to be loved. He learned that, and he practiced it.
It's a lesson that will reshape the peasant doctor's identity, transforming him into a force of evil, primed to take power by any means necessary. In 1956, Francois Duvalier's nemesis, Haitian President Colonel Magloire, is himself overthrown by the army and flees the country. Under an interim government, the country trembles on the brink of civil war, while elections for president are called. Duvalier emerges from hiding and goes to the newspaper office of Bernard Diedrich.
He was very quiet. He was gentle in the way he announced that he was a candidate for the presidency.
His initial objectives were entirely honorable. And he probably was an idealist, and he probably felt that he could do good things in power.
Duvalier is standing as a champion of the impoverished black majority against Louis Desjoyeaux, considered to be a representative of the country's lighter-skinned elite.
He made it a fight of black versus mulatto. In a country where 90% of the people are black, Papa Doc was a shoe-in.
On September 22nd, 1957, the kindly Dr. Duvalier, who cured so many sick people, wins a landslide victory.
I had no idea that there was two sides to this man. I mean, he really fooled us all.
It's the beginning of decades of dictatorship for Haiti.
Oh God, we had no idea what it was going to be like, but it was murder.
As he takes his seat as president of Haiti, Duvalier knows that it's not a secure position.
If you look at the track record of presidents in Haiti, it's not very good. I mean, most of them were short-term. At least 2 of them were actually chopped to pieces by the populace.
Out of 22 heads of state between 1843 and 1915, only 1 completes his full term in office. Even the hero of the Haitian Revolution, General Jean-Jacques Dessalines, met a hideous fate.
Dessalines himself, after 2 or 3 years in power, was actually dismembered in the streets of Port-au-Prince and fed to the pigs.
Papa Doc is determined to be different.
It was very quick, the transition from bumbling country doctor to ruthless dictator.
Duvalier came to realize that the only way to exercise power in Haiti was to be utterly ruthless. So I think that was a kind of pragmatic decision that he reached.
Duvalier quickly sets out to remove the obvious threats to his power. First up, the army.
He knew that the army were the kingmakers, and he needed to make sure that the people in the key position in the army were his appointees.
He sacks the top officers. But for now, at least, they get away with their lives.
That was the start of the way that he was going to operate throughout his presidency, to have successive and unpredictable purges of those who thought they were secure, who thought they were in his favors.
Just months after Papa Doc's inauguration, shots ring out near the palace. It looks like his insecurity is justified.
Duvalier was under threat almost from the start.
Former army officers seize the barracks next to the palace and attempt a coup.
It happened early in the morning, so I went down to the palace. And there was all hell breaking loose. There was 50 caliber machine gun fired. The word spread around that there were 200 rebels.
Fortunately for Duvalier, most of the coup attempts, if you like, were comic opera affairs.
It turns out the coup is not being launched by 200 rebels, but only 8. Duvalier crushes them easily. It's a pivotal moment. He decides that he just cannot trust the army and needs a new force of his own to secure his power.
He felt extremely vulnerable, and he felt he was in need of a Praetorian Guard.
Duvalier decides that he needs his own gang, and that gang has to be meaner and bigger and tougher than the army.
Papa Doc orders the creation of the Volunteers for National Security. The force will become better known by the name of an ogre from Haitian folklore. The Tonton Makout.
The first group of Makouts was taken out of the National Penitentiary. They were murderers, thieves, people who were serving time. And they were recruited from there and given weapons and a blank check to do whatever Duvalier asked them to do.
The signature emblem of the Tonton Makout were the shades they always wore, which gave them a particularly sinister veneer.
The Tonton Makout become a key pillar of Duvalier's regime. In time, they will outnumber the regular army. But running his militia is expensive. Now Duvalier needs money, and he needs weapons. But the best source of cash is the country he hates most, America. The United States has no love for his regime. But then, Duvalier gets a lucky break. In January 1959, Fidel Castro wins his revolution. Cuba, just 50 miles across the Windward Straits from Haiti's shores, becomes communist.
The rise of Castro and the Cuban Revolution was an absolute boon for Duvalier because it took the heat off him in terms of the State Department worrying about the Caribbean.
Duvalier tells the Americans that he is staunchly anti-communist. But he might not always stay that way.
He used it as a constant threat hanging over the Americans to say, oh, well, you know, if you don't give me another sort of $50 million in aid, I might just have to look elsewhere, maybe east, you know, or maybe to our friends over the Windward Straits.
Papa Doc's blackmail works. The United States sends millions in financial aid and a detachment of Marines to train his forces. With the country he hates now bolstering his regime, it seems that Duvalier is secure. But he has an Achilles heel. Papa Doc is a diabetic. On May 24th, 1959, he collapses and falls into a coma. It lasts for some 9 hours. Eventually, Duvalier's right-hand man, Clement Barbeau, administers a glucose injection. Papa Doc regains consciousness.
His life was saved in terms of the initial first aid by Clement Barbeau and then by the Americans who treated him, I believe, at Guantanamo.
But the president wakes up a changed man.
He was in a coma for quite a long period, and there is some evidence that this may have created some brain damage or some long-lasting change in his behavior.
Papa Doc is about to go from ruthless to madly evil.
After that illness, he became a different person.
Papa Doc begins to behave as a powerful voodoo demigod, or Loire, Baron Samedi.
Baron Samedi is the head of the cemetery. He's one of the most powerful voodoo gods.
Baron Samedi in Haitian folklore is the ultimate terrifying figure. He is the person who stalks the graveyard at night. He's the Haitian Grim Reaper.
Papa Doc used to dress himself in black all the time, officially, and with a big humbug hat in his head, just like Baron Samedi is portrayed.
Baron Samedi himself was meant to speak in a particular way. It was a particular sort of low-pitched, lisping sort of voice. Duvalier himself started to affect precisely that voice.
Qu'il flotte désormais dans l'azur pour rappeler à tous les Haïtiens.
It becomes clear to some near him that Duvalier has gone mad.
He was clearly unbalanced.
I think he becomes paranoid about everything and everyone.
The first sign of his change comes when Duvalier decides to overturn the Constitution, which allows him only one term in office. He calls elections in 1961, and there is only one name on the ballot for president: Francois Duvalier.
Well, elections, it's a farce. It was a ritual to celebrate Francois Duvalier's regime.
Papa Doc wins the election by an incredible 1.3 million votes to 0. The New York Times reports that Latin America has witnessed many fraudulent elections throughout its history, but none more outrageous than the one which has just taken place in Haiti. It's a victory that sets up his second term to be far more evil than the first.
That's when the regime becomes totally brutal, absolutely paranoid. That is the beginning of utter violence.
Using the army and his private militia, the Tonton Makout, Papa Doc establishes a reign of terror.
Brutality became institutionalized and pervasive throughout the island.
Duvalier's Tonton Makout infiltrate every stratum of Haitian society.
It was a system that probably similar in terms of silencing the population as the Stasi in East Germany.
The main purpose of this terror is simple greed. Even though Haiti is desperately poor, Papa Doc and his cronies set about milking it dry. Millions of dollars in taxes and aid vanish into the pockets of his regime.
It was all about money. I think it would be wrong to dignify Duvalierism with the name of an ideology. It wasn't really an ideology. It was generalized kleptocracy. It was the mob running a country.
The people who suffered most were really the poorest Haitians.
There were thousands of anonymous victims of Duvalier, people being tortured to death and shot and murdered because they wouldn't give their daughter to the local Makouts or because they wouldn't give their business to the local Makout. Nobody knows how many people that the Makouts killed.
The dictator is now increasingly paranoid, lurking most of the time in his heavily fortified palace. When he does venture out, it is under heavy guard. To show that he cares for his people, he hands out petty cash. It's his way of proving to himself how much his people love him.
I mean, I remember Duvalier in his car throwing money at people and people running to get, you know, $1 or something like that. So, to me, that was utter indignity.
Washington has been providing millions of dollars a year in aid to Haiti. But it's clear that the money is being siphoned off. President Kennedy decides he has had enough of the mad dictator, Papa Doc.
Kennedy was really anti-Duvalier and was doing everything possible to get rid of him.
Kennedy cuts financial aid and looks for ways to reintroduce democracy. It seems that Papa Doc's time in office may be running out. But then, the unthinkable happens.
When Kennedy was assassinated on the 22nd of November, Papa Doc Duvalier had champagne at his palace with his sycophants.
Incredibly, Papa Doc claims the assassination is all down to him. He explains that he put a voodoo curse on Kennedy, and that it's no coincidence the president was killed on November the 22nd.
He did everything on the 22nd. The 22nd was his lucky day. He got elected on September 22nd. He was inaugurated October 22nd. And he purported to have killed Kennedy on November 22nd, 1963.
His boasting is designed to reinforce the idea that no matter how powerful they may be, the fate of anyone who opposes Papa Doc is death.
If your president is in some sense synonymous with this supernatural taker of lives, then he is not to be messed with.
With Kennedy gone, the pressure from the United States is off Papa Doc. But Duvalier soon realizes he has other problems. 13 young Haitians based in New York decide that now they have to take matters into their own hands. Calling themselves the Jeune Haiti, or Young Haiti, they set sail for their homeland in summer 1964.
When Kennedy was assassinated, Jeune Haiti movement felt that they had lost a great supporter. And they didn't feel that the Johnson administration would push through with program that Kennedy had for Haiti.
Most of the Jeune Haiti have lost family to Papa Doc's brutal regime. Inspired by Castro's success in Cuba, they land in Haiti and attempt to start a revolution.
13 of them left New York and went to Haiti to carry out guerrilla movement, just like Castro did in the Sierra Maestra. They were going to do that in the mountains of Haiti.
But But the rebels quickly discover that the geography of Haiti is not well suited to guerrilla warfare.
But the mountains of Haiti were not as wooded as Sierra Maestra. And Papa Doc, who had his goons throughout Haiti, tracked them down.
One by one, the members of the Jeune Haiti are killed. The first to die is Ivan Larac. His body is returned to Papa Doc.
He actually left the stinking body in an armchair outside the arrivals hall of Port-au-Prince International Airport, so that the few tourists that Haiti got at the time went through passport control, went out to get their taxi, only to be confronted by this decaying, rotting body.
For months, the Jeune Haiti struggle on in the mountains. Eventually, 11 of the group are killed, and the remaining 2 captured. They are returned to Port-au-Prince, where their execution is set for November 12th, 1964.
Duvalier declared a public holiday, told school teachers that they had to bring their school children to watch the executions. This is how we deal with the enemies of Haiti. The executions were filmed and were played on television for weeks afterwards.
Marcel Numa, a graduate of the Bronx Merchant Marine Academy, and Louis Drouin, a finance graduate and bank worker in New York, are defiant to the bitter end.
The execution was typical of Duvalier's sense, rather macabre sense of theatre, that if you could stage an execution, then televise it, and to make it even more grotesque, bring in a group of school children to witness it, because then the impact throughout Haiti would have been immense.
I remember watching on TV the live execution of Marcel Numa and Gus Lévy-Douin. I mean, here you have 2 guys who are standing, you know, with their hands in their back, and then all of a sudden they shoot at them and then they fall. That has never been able to be erased from my mind. It's like yesterday I was seeing it.
The tyrant discovers that most of the revolutionaries come from the town of Jérémie, a stronghold of opposition. Papa Doc unleashes his horrific vengeance on the town.
Duvalier was someone who relished revenge. He wasn't one to enjoy it cold. I mean, he preferred it hot.
Families were taking children and wives killed first, with their husbands watching, and then the husbands killed.
It's not clear how many people died, but it's probably in the thousands.
It tells you something about Duvalier, and that is that he wanted punishment to be exemplary, and therefore the more blood-curdling, the more violent, the more indiscriminate, the more effective it was.
By the end of 1964, Duvalier has killed thousands of people and has got what he always wanted: total power. Inside Haiti, there is simply no opposition left. There is nothing that can stop his evil regime.
I think by this period, Duvalier could be defined as a megalomaniac. Power is everything. There is no alternative. He can't leave, he can't retire, he's got to stay there. So whatever it takes, he will do.
Yet total power is not enough for Papa Doc. He wants to be more than a president. He wants to become a god. In June 1964, the tyrannical President Francois Papa Doc Duvalier moves to take total and perpetual control of the country. He's used brutal violence to hold on to power for almost 7 years already, even overturning the Constitution to allow himself a second term in office. Now he goes further. holding a constitutional referendum to make himself president for life. Unsurprisingly, he wins with 99.9% of the vote.
I have been elected for president for life. It is not my desire, but it is the iron will of the Haitian people.
Papa Doc's madness now goes to new and truly extreme levels. Addressing the nation, he delivers a bombshell. He declares that he is more than human. He is an immaterial being. Bullets cannot hurt him.
He was essentially saying that he was eternal. He was some sort of spirit hovering over Haiti.
Papa Doc is now stating openly what many Haitians already believe, that he is an incarnation of the dreaded voodoo Loire, Baron Samedi, guardian of the graveyard. Violence may have won him his position as president for life, but what will keep him there is voodoo.
Duvalier had more power in Haiti than the arms, the weapons, the men he had around. Papa Doc used voodoo to control the nation.
Ever since the Yours campaign and dressing up as Baron Samedi, Papa Doc has played on the perception that he has supernatural powers.
The vision he had for himself was full control of the society through mystical power.
Papa Doc starts creating myths about himself. Rumors circulate that Duvalier makes a journey into the hills. He goes to a cave known as the True Faubourg. It's a sacred voodoo site where he is believed to have found something terrifyingly useful.
They brought back from Trou Faubourg a bunch of demons called Baka. And he had them installed. They lived, I don't know what they did there, but they lived in the cellars of the National Palace. The idea that he's got these demons ready to unleash is quite a disincentive to revolt or rebellion.
Papa Doc needs to demonstrate to his people that he really does have voodoo powers. So he orders his men to hijack a funeral and steals the casket of his former friend and sometime political rival, Clément Jumel. Soon a story starts circulating about how he closets himself in a room with Jumel's corpse and appears to communicate with it.
Papa Doc is letting people think he has power to even talk to the dead. Death in Haiti, for many people, is not natural. So people think that Duvalier had made a zombie out of Jumel.
For his voodoo rituals, Papa Doc often does not need the whole body. Sometimes he demands that the decapitated heads of his enemies are brought to him. Again, bizarre rumors circulate about what he does with them.
Duvalier became convinced that you could actually extract intelligence from the heads of political enemies. He would actually sit in the bath, sometimes complete with top hat, and consult the head of this opponent.
The purpose of these rituals is to scare his uneducated and superstitious nation. Is Duvalier so mad that he actually believes in them too? Some who knew him say he does not, but what is beyond doubt is that he knows how to use voodoo.
Duvalier used to smile because he was an atheist. He didn't believe in voodoo. He didn't believe in anything, just power.
To have peace and stability, you should have a strong man in every country.
By the end of the 1960s, Papa Doc is more than president for life. He has his people thinking he is almost a god. But there is one force he cannot evade: his own mortality.
He has so terrified, murdered, cowed the opposition that the only enemy really left is the Grim Reaper and his own failing health.
Unlike most dictators, Duvalier may get to rule until the end of his natural life. The trouble is, he's now in his early 60s, riven with diabetes, congestive heart failure, and brain damage from his coma in 1959. So now he sets about securing a legacy for himself and his brutally corrupt regime. By the beginning of the 1970s, Papa Doc's voodoo persona dominates Haiti. People believe that he really is Baron Samedi.
The whole of Duvalierism was about the establishment of terror. And it was a terror that was inside people's heads. People were even afraid to think bad thoughts about Duvalier.
Papa Doc's brutal regime may have killed 30,000 Haitians. But the official line is that Duvalier is a living god. Across Haiti are monuments to the ego of the tyrant. His name is spelled out in lights at the National Palace.
After the President for Life move comes the cult of personality, where Duvalier wants to project himself as almost synonymous with the country.
No praise is too great for the supreme Papa Doc.
They fell over each other to invent new superlatives to describe him.
Master of the crossroads, the Haitian flag floating, and the man who sees forever.
The Lord's Prayer is rewritten as a prayer to Papa Doc, so our Doc who art in the National Palace.
All the while, the people are being made to worship him. The tyrant is sucking the nation dry, stealing millions of dollars a year from the Haitian people.
This basically took the form of extortion of taxes on everybody, on businessmen, on peanut vendors, anybody who get money. Even a few cents, it all mounted up.
One of the most grandiose excuses for extra taxation is a whole new town, Duvalierville. It's intended to be a show of modernity and hope for Haiti, but never gets finished.
This money went pretty much directly into the pockets of Duvalier and his family and his cronies.
But Duvalier is still a trained doctor. He knows that his own death is around the corner, so he sets about securing his legacy.
It was something that happened fairly quickly, but systematically.
Papa Doc's eldest son, Jean-Claude, is still a teenager, brought up in the palace living a life of luxury and cut off from the concerns of normal Haitians. Nevertheless, his father decides that he will inherit the presidency.
Prior to that, Jean-Claude was known simply as a kind of a fat playboy.
He appears in public with his son and anoints him officially as the next president for life. On April 21st, 1971, the tyrant, Papa Doc, dies peacefully in his bed. His son Jean-Claude becomes Baby Doc and will continue the corrupt Duvalier regime for another 15 years. Ultimately, he is overthrown and dies of a heart attack, aged 63, while awaiting trial for his crimes. Papa Doc's true legacy is that he destroyed a dream and unleashed a nightmare. His crimes haunt Haiti to this day.
I think Haiti was permanently scarred and disfigured by Duvalier.
Haiti is now the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, crippled by a lack of education and racked by political chaos.
The institutions were destroyed, the families were destroyed, the country in a whole was destroyed. The only one to benefit from those atrocities was himself.
How evil was Papa Doc? I think Duvalier was evil incarnate.